Sikh Research Institute's mission is to provide educational resources to Sikhs to lead a Guru-inspired life. As a global nonprofit organization, we produce original online courses, research papers, videos, podcasts, events, and books to create the largest go-to source of Sikh knowledge online. Today's class is a part of a live series, Love and Justice through Guru Nanak Sahib. This class serves as an immersive introduction into the principles of the Sikh faith, told through the primary source of the Guru Granth Sahib and secondary historic texts on the life of Guru Nanak Sahib. This class will begin with a 40-minute lecture, followed by 15 to 20 minutes of Q&A. So please, again, drop your questions in the chat box and be sure to include your name and city. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our instructor. I'm sure you're fairly familiar with her, but Asha Marie Kaur is a research assistant with Sikhi. She is a BA in Political Science and International Studies from Northwestern University. Her work at Sikhi is tied to her love of the Persian language and the ways it connects Iran, Afghanistan, Central Asia, and the Indian subcontinent. Please welcome Asha Marie.
Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh. Welcome to the third session of Love and Justice. Last week I was actually a little under the weather, but I'm feeling a lot better this week. So very excited for this session where we're going to be talking about the historical influences of the era in Guru Nanak Sahib's lifetime. And I think this session flows really well from what we discussed last week about the Bhakti movement, because we're going to be getting into how our own understandings of the world around us and our current context can get projected into the past in ways that maybe aren't the best for really seeing the essence of Guru Nanak Sahib's life and work. All right, so I want to begin by, we're always in the process of unlearning as we're learning. And I want to begin with a very commonly stated understanding of the Sikh faith. This is something that is promoted both by Sikh scholars, some Sikh scholars, and I would say the vast majority of non-Sikh scholars that write on Sikhi. And this is the notion that the Sikh faith is a syncretic blend between Hinduism and Islam, and the faith that comes out of Guru Nanak Sahib's lifetime takes the best elements of both traditions. So this notion comes from this is people's way of making sense of repeated references to both Hindu and Muslim practice in the Guru Granth Sahib, and they're not wrong that those references are integral to the Guru Granth Sahib. But this is kind of a simplistic way of absorbing these references, particularly because at no point is the Guru Granth Sahib limiting itself to references to Hindu and Muslim practice. Jain practice comes up, Buddhist practice, indigenous practices, etc., etc. But also, making such references doesn't mean that the stated aim of the Sikh charter is to blend. Instead, we can look at these references not as the pieces of the faith that are being kind of stuck together in a mosaic, but instead the experiences that Guru Nanak Sahib and the Gurus and the Bhagats and the Bhatts and all the contributors to the Guru Granth Sahib, which we'll learn more in depth about in the session about the structure of the Guru Granth Sahib. These are the experiences they're having, these are the things they're interacting with. And so when they set out to create a new path, it's based on reflection of these prevailing ideas. Anytime we act in a creative mode, we first have to reflect on our surroundings. When we're doing research, we're looking at different sources, but I can't write a book that's just chapters of other people's books strung together. We all, when we write, we read, we absorb, we reflect, we think, and then we create something new. Otherwise, that's plagiarism. So the Sikh faith stands on its own, but there was no way to talk about how we should live life and how to engage with the world without making references to the way the world was at that time. And the matter of the fact was that in South Asia, the predominant prevailing beliefs came from Hindu and Muslim practice. So let's try to shed this notion of blending, syncretism, check that at the door today, and instead think about reflection and acting in a creative mode and creating a new path forward. Again, it's very easy for us to take the realities of our current era and to draw up historical and to think that history is written in the same, that the era that we write about in history functions in the same way, but there's a lot of big differences. So let's think about today. We are really, really fortunate to be living in an era where the common person's story is almost as accessible and as available as anyone else's. There are more literate people in the world than there ever were in history. We have social media where ordinary people can be seen. Even an archive, any archive from the past 100 years has stories of the common person, and you don't need to be a king or a ruler to be seen, to be heard, to be written about. That was not true for the vast majority of history. Almost all of the history we consume is really limited to the stories of those who are written about, and to be written about required literally having a court of people whose occupation was to day after day record your thoughts and what you were doing. So what we have is a historical record that's mostly about institutional and religious authorities, people who led religious movements, people who stood at the top of state structures and pre-modern state structures. And again, we talked last week about how our own lived assumptions can get reflected on the Bhakti movement. For example, we have ideas today of what constitutes being a Hindu or being a Muslim, and so we can reflect those back in ways that may not be accurate. This is all to say that another very common trope, I would say, that's invoked when discussing the creation of the Sikh faith is that this was an era of great religious conflict and turmoil in South Asia. This isn't totally false, because there were authorities and institutions that were battling it out with each other. But the idea that there was this Hindu-Muslim war is a little bit of a misnomer. Actually, I would say it's quite a bit of a misrepresentation, especially when you think about the fact that the dynasty that fell in Guru Nanak Sahib's lifetime, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, the Lodi dynasty, was overthrown by the first Mughal emperor, Babur, and these were both Muslim leaders, Muslim empires. So there was a conflict, Muslim to Muslim, there. And the readings kind of talk about how actually on that macro level, the conflict between Hindu and Muslim state structures and leadership had occurred much earlier, particularly in the 10th century. That's when the Ghaznavid Empire began to extend itself. It's when Islam came into what is now Iran, what is now Afghanistan, what is now Pakistan. And actually things had, in a way, settled a bit as far as figuring out the place of where Muslim leadership would go and Hindu leadership would go. But of course, there's always dynasties and empires fighting each other. There's expansion. There's land being lost and gained. This and there's also this kind of rigid divide we have in our head that, okay, this is the Muslim dynasty, and so Muslims were doing this, and these are the Hindus, and they're over there. That's also a false. We have historical records that show us that that's a false understanding of what happened. There were Brahmins that advised the Mughal Empire. Lots of texts were written both in Persian and Sanskrit. Scripts were not given this sort of religious connotation. So Sanskrit wasn't necessarily just a Hindu script. The way it is, it's invoked as a Hindu script today by rising Hindu nationalist leaders in India in particular, who seek to also re-Sanskritize the names of places that were named in the Mughal Empire, so on and so forth. So there was cultural engagement, interaction. There were Hindu authorities advising Muslim authorities, and vice versa. One of the readings, the shorter one, did a good job of explaining what the differences were when the state structure was Hindu versus Muslim. And a lot of that has to do with stuff that perhaps doesn't sell as well when we're talking about history, kind of mundane things like taxes. Like, no one wants to learn about the history of taxes, really. I mean, I'm sure there's some professors who that's their life work, and I respect that. But that's kind of mundane, so I think that's why we don't hear about that in our common speech as much. You know, people love to talk about this clash of civilizations. We don't want to talk about different ways of paying taxes. But what the reading said was that Hindu practice in general was much more broken up into localized traditions than it is today. The codification of Hinduism had not happened yet. That occurred mainly under the British, who really sought to define what the indigenous Indian religion was versus the religion from outside, which was Islam. So we already have this
It seems we have lost Asha. If you could just give us a minute or two to see where she is. I'm sure she'll be right back. So sorry about this.
my internet. This pandemic has been very bad for the internet connection in my neighborhood. But I will pick up where I left off, which was that temples and the pundits who oversaw temples would collect money, but this, because of the hyper-localized nature of this meant there was a little bit more room for there to be, say, in one area, it's a Jain temple where people's money is going, or in another area, a Buddhist temple, though Buddhism had a very sharp decline in South Asia, as we know. We don't really associate Buddhism anymore with India in the same way. Whereas with Islam, there was really these Muslim rulers, a lot of them, they had various degrees of religiosity and religious authority, but they would say this is the religion of the state, and it was tied to, they would appoint individuals that would oversee a block of land and would collect taxes, and there wasn't the same room for there to be different streams, and throughout history there were taxes imposed by different Muslim leaders onto non-Muslims who had to pay a special tax called jizya. So it was, we can think about these Muslim state structures as a little more cosmopolitan, as in they're more overarching, and honestly a little bit more similar to what we kind of know as leadership structures today in modern nation states as well. And just because the people appointed were Muslims didn't necessarily mean that these were people who wielded spiritual authority. There are also people who wield spiritual authority who are not in charge of collecting taxes. So I really want everyone to have like a really firm grounding in a lot of the vocabulary about religious authorities. So we're actually going to go through these historic figures, some of which are roles which exist today, some of which don't, through the individuals in Guru Nanak Sahib's life. And that will really prepare us to read Shabad and talk about the Janam Sakhis and get more immersed into his lifetime. The reason why this vocabulary is all really important for us to digest is because in its essence, the IkOankar paradigm was exercised by Guru Nanak Sahib as a disruption of authority. Because authoritative figures create divisions, they block things out, they say you belong here, you belong there. And as we know, that does not fall in line with the structure of IkOankar and the structure of oneness and being unable to divide others and unable to impose categories onto others. It's not your place to do that. So Guru Nanak Sahib speaks out against unjust and also simply flawed, incompatible with IkOankar actions by the Brahmins, for example, who are at the top of the caste hierarchy, yogis who are practitioners of yoga. For those of you who don't come from South Asian context, I want to note that a yogi is not just like a person who does yoga, which is kind of how it's used today, especially with the modern yoga phenomenon. You have to be of a certain caste status to be a yogi in this time, and you still do in a lot of South Asian context. And it gives you authority as per the Vedas, as per Vedic practice. So this is not just like, oh, I'm gonna go take a course and like I'll be a yogi now. It's very much a religious title, and there's also money involved in all of these things. Like the caste hierarchy is tied to occupation, not occupation in the way that we think of it today, because the way we think about it today, occupation is a category that's mutable. We can change it. We are not our occupation. In caste, you are your occupation. As Ambedkar, who is a very important anti-caste leader in modern Indian history, would say, it's not the division of labor, it's a division of the laborers themselves. So the Brahmin, it is his occupation to conduct religious rituals. So there is money involved in that. This is very much an economic and political position as much as it is a religious one, and there's a lot of room for exploitation there. Guru Nanak Sahib speaks out against unjust actions by the Qazi, an Islamic judge, though it's used kind of loosely in this era to mean anyone who's preaching Islam with textual authority. The mullah or the Maulavi, the Islamic teacher, again, kind of a loose term, similar to like an imam today. The siddha, which is the proven one in yogic order, it's the highest status you can attain, and various rulers, landowners, emperors, kings, and there's a lot of vocabulary that ties into the ownership of land. All right, so we're gonna give a little sneak peek, a little taste of how Gurbani speaks about these individuals. This is from page 662 of the Guru Granth Sahib, and Guru Nanak Sahib says, "O Qazi, the money and fame that you gain by your false decisions is devious. O Brahmin, you perform rituals and take cleaning baths, while misleading and looting people. O yogi, you instruct people to run away to the mountains. So as you can see here, there's kind of a common denominator in all of this commentary, which is that Guru Nanak Sahib is speaking out against authorities who exploit the common person. And that is also the common denominator of the Bhagats that we discussed last week, and that is the unifying theme of the Bhakti movement. So it's not Hindu versus Muslim, but there is criticism of the ways Hindu practice and Muslim practice can be exploited in a particular way to harm the common person. But this is not to say that because of your identity as a Hindu, your identity as a Muslim, there's something wrong. In fact, the common person is not being attacked much here at all. It's only when you engage with exploitative actions and you give a justification that comes from your religion that Guru Nanak Sahib starts reflecting on that. How are you able to do that? Are you right in your logic? Like, how do we undo these things that we hold to be so true and so real that are really just meaningless social constructs that we've created to leech money out of people, to have the right to rule over someone, to make decisions for them, to oppress them? And so I think if we look at it that way, we try to remove this whole clash of civilizations idea that is really tempting to fall into, and it's how a lot of history is looked at. It's how people talk about modern day issues as well. Move away from that and think instead that Guru Nanak Sahib is always trying to advocate for an honest living. Always trying to advocate for an honest living. That doesn't mean ordinary people don't get called upon or invoked or given something to think about. It's just that the extent of the harm you can do only goes up the more authority you have based on these false social structures that put you at the top of a hierarchy. And Sikhi is fundamentally anti-hierarchical. There's a reason we don't have a Qazi or a Pandit or any of these. We don't have our own designations like that in Sikhi. So there's the path of the Sikh, there's a path of the Guru Sikh, there's a path you can take. You can be an Amritdhari, but it's not a hierarchy, and you're not a ruler over people. There are people that are wise, there are people that we look to for wisdom, for expertise, but they don't have this sort of divine power over us because there's no one who's further and closer to IkOankar. We all are IkOankar. Now, I also want to look at the third line here very carefully. O yogi, you instruct people to run away to the mountains. Guru Nanak Sahib is very critical of forms of detachment, of seeking the divine by trying to extricate yourself from that which is around you. Because, again, in the IkOankar paradigm, you can't do that. You're always here, connected with everything else, so you have to deal with it. That is just, you can run, but you're not running from anything. It's an illusion. This is important to note because what Guru Nanak Sahib calls for that is quite different from what we can call the anti-orthodox thinkers of the previous eras in the Bhakti movement, in Sufism, is that a lot of people who were upset with the authorities of the time sought salvation and freedom and liberation in trying to remove themselves in meditation, and also dealt with the difficulty and shame of being in a corrupt society by self-flagellating, by punishing themselves, by harming the body, by fasting for many days on end, for hanging themselves upside down in a tree to see what that felt like. And Guru Nanak Sahib says, no, you don't need to do that. You don't need to punish yourself for existing. And so he is critical of those actions, and is crafting a way to be in the world, a system of governance, but one that is non-hierarchical. And I think this is really, really important to look at. I think today we have these issues too, where we assume that people who want to remove hierarchy have kind of an individual, maybe they think we're all supposed to be individuals just floating around with no governance. No, that's not the case. But Guru Nanak Sahib wants governance to be an opt-in project where you're doing the work and you're choosing to be there, instead of being brought in by force, power, or a threat of violence, or a threat. That threat of violence doesn't have to be physical. A threat of spiritual violence. Well, you don't listen to me, you're going to hell. Or you don't listen to me, you're going to be reincarnated as XYZ lesser thing. So it was new then. It's still new to a lot of people now. So it's just as hard for us to grapple with. All right, so let's move into who's in Guru Nanak Sahib's life and how can they help us look at the historical context in a more real and tangible way. We want to look at these real individuals. I do want to note that there's no known portrait of Guru Nanak Sahib or any of the 10 Gurus. Any portrayals are just to assist in envisioning things. For me, it helps to see visuals. And also there's no known portraits of a lot of the people that I'll be depicting, but I try to get things from different sources and different artists so we can get some diversity in portrayals. So this is a painting of an artist's portrayal of Guru Nanak Sahib's birth. In this photograph, we have Mata Tripta, his mother, Meta Kalu, his father, Bibi Nanki is his older sister, whom Nanak is named after. Bibi Dalta is the Muslim midwife who helped birth him. Pandit Hardial is the village
Apologies again to all those tuning in. These are just some of the
village of Talwandi, which is now known as Nankana Sahib and is in modern-day Pakistan. So the zamindar collects the taxes for a village and then moves that revenue upstream to the Nawab. Guru Nanak Sahib goes on to work for the Nawab of Lahore, who is also overseeing Sultanpur Lodi, which is where his sister Bibi Nanki moves to after her marriage. Guru Nanak Sahib goes on to marry a woman known as Mata Sulakhni. Also, it was, we see context everywhere. That's really important to pick up on. It was very controversial for Guru Nanak Sahib to go live with his sister after her marriage because there's a tradition that existed then and unfortunately still exists now in Hindu ideology that you should not interact with the women in your family once they've been given away to the next family. So Guru Nanak Sahib had a very radical sibling relationship, which I really appreciate. All right, so Pandit Hardial is called in to oversee ceremony for the family. He gives astrological predictions. This is a painting of the Janeu ceremony that we will talk about later that Guru Nanak Sahib rejected. This is the ceremony by which an upper caste boy becomes a man by being given the Janeu, which marks his caste superiority. It's not a ceremony that people of the lower castes or no caste status are eligible for. It's not something women are eligible for. and that is the reason why Guru Nanak Sahib rejected this ceremony. But that was a big deal to do. It was essentially a boycott because his family paid Pandit Hardayal money and they bought food for all these people. It's in front of the whole village. So as you can see, these things they have a political and financial connotation. So Rai Bular is the zamindar. The relationship between Guru Nanak Sahib and Rai Bular, I think, is very interesting and powerful because Rai Bular was one of the early people who was inspired by Guru Nanak Sahib and became a follower of his. He was a Muslim. And he was sitting in on the Janeu ceremony, he would come around to these, what we would think of as Hindu only, like we would think that the audience would only be Hindu, but he was there. Because Rai Bular was a rich guy and a powerful guy. But he really changed the way he conducted himself due to Guru Nanak Sahib's influence, and so they had a friendship all the way till Rai Bular's death. So this is important. No one is irredeemable just because of their hierarchical status. It's what they do with that status that matters, and there's ways to dismantle privilege, which is really shown by this relationship. So Guru Nanak Sahib was of a privileged enough background that he was sent for schooling. Again, we cannot look at literacy as a common thing based on our own modern context. For the vast majority of history, it was like single-digit percentages of people were literate, but Sikhi really changed that for people who became Sikhs because the Gurmukhi script was standardized and created so that the common person could have access to literacy, and reading of Gurbani is such an integral part of the faith. So what are the languages Guru Nanak Sahib learns? What do they have to do with the history? So colloquially speaking, Old Punjabi, but there wasn't a standardized script for Old Punjabi then. There was only Shamukhi was the only standardized script, and that is Arabic script. So Guru Nanak Sahib goes to Maulvi Kutubuddin to learn Persian and Arabic. Guru Nanak Sahib was fluent in both. It really assisted him on his travels through what is now Iran, Afghanistan, Iraq, Saudi Arabia, etc. So this is, again, religion and education all tied up together back then. There was no way to get an education that wasn't going to be disseminated from a religious authority. So on the other hand, Guru Nanak Sahib goes to learn Sanskrit from Pandit Gopal. And so again, both of these men were religious figures as well as educators, and the students were people of a high enough caste and class background to be able to both fund an education and to be considered worthy of it, particularly in the context of Sanskrit. That was not available to people of lower caste. It was actually forbidden. Part of the Brahmin's occupation is to be the one who controls literacy in society. Guru Nanak Sahib's best friend, lifelong companion, was Bhai Mardana, who was a Muslim from his that he became close with as probably an adolescent, teenager. Bhai Mardana was a player of the rabab, which is a very prominent South and Central Asian instrument. Probably practiced along Sufi lines. What's interesting is we do consider Bhai Mardana one of the first Sikhs, but when Bhai Mardana passed away, Guru Nanak Sahib still performed the Janaza funeral prayer of Islam for Bhai Mardana. So he never felt the need to tell Mardana that he had to go, like he had to forsake anything. So I do think this is not, it's not a fact that's known that well, and I think it's honestly a very beautiful thing to think about friendship and creating something new with someone and being an integral part of the building of something, but still having one's own identity, and Guru Nanak Sahib still respected that upon his death. So Bhai Mardana is going to be really important in discussion of the Janam Sakhis and pretty much every story we're going to talk about, because Bhai Mardana traveled with Guru Nanak Sahib throughout all of his travels. So they were together for a lot of different events. So these are the big name rulers of the time. We have Sultan Ibrahim Lodi, the last emperor of the Lodi dynasty, which was an Afghan dynasty, which ruled from 1451 to 1526. Ibrahim Lodi is violently overthrown by Emperor Babur, the first Ibrahim Lodi did not rule from 1451 to 1526. That was the entire Lodi dynasty. And then Emperor Babur became the first emperor of the Mughal Empire. He was of Turkic origin from Uzbekistan, and he was born Zaharuddin Muhammad. And the Mughal Empire would rule all the way until the British Raj dissolved it, with varying levels of strength leading up till that time. So this was a violent conflict between two Muslim leaders, but the people who suffered were the civilians who were killed in the carnage, who were of all backgrounds, and the people who suffered the most within that from the Hindu population, from the Muslim population, were women. So we are going to discuss the Gurbani in which Guru Nanak Sahib witnesses the war crimes of Babur, and also reflects upon the excess and the exploitation of the Lodi dynasty as well. And he specifically speaks about the crimes against women, rape as a tool of war. So we're going to have a whole session on that. This is Guru Nanak Sahib is witnessing genocide and actually gets sent to prison for speaking on this, which is a highly relevant phenomenon for us to think about today, with a lot of really brave uprisings occurring right here in the US and all over the world. So these are the top of all the hierarchical structures. And yeah, Emperor Babur was of Turkic origin, but in his lifetime, both of these empires were Persian speaking as well. Babur kind of switched from preferring Turkish to preferring Persian in his lifetime. So a lot of the time when Guru Nanak Sahib is speaking specifically to issues of state structure and land ownership and ruling based on land ownership and taxation, it's more likely that he'll be using Persian and Arabic vocabulary and speech in those shabads. So I have a talk on this where I pull out the Gurbani that is in pure Persian, and you can really see that there's a common theme. And that's because it was the language of governance for South Asia at the time. So kind of like how today in India, English isn't anyone's ethnic language, it's not any particular group's language, but it is the language of leadership. That's how we can think of Persian back then. But then it became useful to speak to people, as Guru Nanak Sahib did make his way through Persian-speaking regions where it's spoken as the language of the ethnic group in what is now Iran, Afghanistan, etc. So yeah, in the next session, we're going to get into the Janam Sakhis, which tell us of the queens, the kings, beggars, rulers, sheikhs, yogis, black magic practitioners, monks, maids, prisoners, carpenters, and many more. influenced by the Shabad of Guru Nanak Sahib, and how these very personal interactions informed how the Sikh faith was built, how it was spread, the types of people involved in its creation, and these were very expansive journeys. And then on the nature of the Janam Sakhis and their style, we're going to discuss how do we know what we know about Guru Nanak Sahib's life, what can we know, what can we not know, what's really beyond our ability to verify, and how do we learn from sources that are written in this superfluous, exalting style and do describe supernatural events. Like, how do we interpret that as something that did happen but is being described in a certain way? I want to cover one last thing before going to Q&A. As far as, I want us to end off on really thinking about how we project things back. 2 major points. The first is that despite there being extreme levels of conflict, tension, a lot of negotiations between Hindu leadership and Muslim leadership in Guru Nanak Sahib's era, there was also, as we know, the powerful informed the powerful and worked together for mutual gain quite often. These days, I think we actually live much more segregated lives. I think oftentimes when we have our religious ceremonies, for example, there may be only people of one faith present. Institutionally, if we interact with religious institutions, we're probably only interacting with one type of religious institutions. But because so many parts of daily life are wrapped up in religion back then, it wasn't really that way to be segregated. So it doesn't matter if you're a Hindu or a Muslim, the guy you're paying your taxes to is Muslim. It does, and to get an education, you have to engage with religious leadership. So if it's really positive, it would help you to learn Persian and Arabic, but you're going to go to a Muslim religious authority to do that. So, and even things like the Muslim midwife who helped birth Guru Nanak Sahib, I mean, frankly, a lot of people in India today wouldn't regularly invite someone into their home to help them undergo such an intimate task. So I think that it's easy for us to, because of the very real and oftentimes very violent context of what was going on in South Asia, we tend to think that every part of day-to-day life had this animosity, but that's not true. And that's not to say that everything was like super peaceful and great, but I think it's much more useful to look at the way common people are fighting against exploitation coming from many different sources than to think about groups of people going at each other. The second thing is thinking about what is a Hindu, what is a Muslim. The handout that I wrote up discusses how Hinduism as one thing, again, was very much codified in more modern times, and really what was much more salient back then was not Hinduism, but rather caste. And the word Hindu literally just meant those from that side of the Indus River. So a lot of times when you see Guru Nanak Sahib talk about Hindus, he then says Turks as the kind of other group and kind of deconstructs these labels. He's like, well, you say you do this because you're a Hindu, you say you do this because you're a Turk. When he says Turk, that's referring to the fact that the leaders of the leadership in the Mughal Empire was of Turkic origin, and therefore a lot of Muslims were considered to be of Turkic origin. So we can't look at our own understandings of today's labels and apply them 100% fully. Guru Nanak Sahib is really specific with his language. We need to honor that, and we need to be very observant. So Guru Nanak Sahib has a lot of criticisms of Brahmanism, because Brahmanism is inherently hierarchical. It is inherently oppressive of those that are seen as lesser. So there's a lot of specific talk about people of this caste are exercising unjust, exploitative authority in this way. And it's similar in Islam when he's talking about exploitation. He speaks about those who have that authority to wield in that way. And when talking about regular people, he says, you can choose how you practice, what your practices may be, where they align. There's some things that just cannot be compatible with IkOankar, like caste. It's not possible. The other thing that is inherently incompatible with IkOankar is this idea that there's a believer and a non-believer, as in, because you professed Islam, like, you're going to go to a better place after we die, and those who didn't are going to hell, like, that's incompatible as well. So there's some things that are just fundamentally incompatible. As far as specific practice, we'll have a whole session on this. Guru Nanak Sahib's not trying to condemn a group of people based on their identity or necessarily based on their practice if the practice is not exploitative or unjust towards others. But he does say, hey, like, if you're doing something because you think it's making you more divine, but your actions aren't matching up with that, if your internal thoughts, if your treatment of people doesn't match up with the supposed pure meaning and intent of, say, fasting, circumcision, doing puja, all these things, then you're playing a game, and it's not one that's making any real impact, and it's an illusion, and the more we spend in illusion, the further
Apologies for that again. I'm just going to see if Asha's internet is back up. Sorry, these are some of the challenges that we face in this reality. Sorry, if you'll just be patient with us, that would be appreciated. Asha, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, awesome. I think you were in the middle of a sentence when you cut out.
Just happy to go to questions.
Okay, awesome, lovely. So our first question is from Rajdeep. They ask, I understand that part of the Guru's mission was to cause us to question and perhaps even get rid of hierarchies between people. But does this mean hierarchy as such can be dismissed? For instance, a hierarchy of values. For example, love and truth are higher values than pride and attachment. That's from Rajdeep in Sacramento.
Okay, so I think what I'm getting out of this question is that, does that mean that we're kind of creating our own hierarchy? Because pride and attachment are modes of being that are condemned in Gurbani. So is that creating a hierarchy? So I think a helpful way to look at this is not as a hierarchy, but as one thing that we can sort out is what are actions that promote connection versus separation, that promote engagement versus illusion. So we all exist within IkOankar, and the only thing that keeps us from accessing that at all times is our ego, which creates the illusion of separation, which leads us to look for specific things to attach to make us feel grounded. And the only way to access the vastness and the entirety of the structure of IkOankar is to let go of those smaller attachments and to try to lift that veil of separation and illusion. So we do avoid notions of like good versus bad, but if we want to look at it because it's helpful for us as a way of sorting good and bad, I think one axis that we can put in there is that connection separation spectrum. So for example, there's a lot of Gurbani that talks about the dangers of attachment to family. When I first started reading Gurbani on a deeper and more committed level, I was actually kind of disturbed and like unsettled by these sorts of invocations. I was like, am I not supposed to love my family? And it feels really off, especially because the Gurus told us that we should value the household. But then I realized that the message is that if you're saying, oh, I love my family and therefore like I'm only going to hoard resources for my family and I got to watch out for my family and the rest of you are not ever going to be as valuable of human beings, that's a sense of false attachment. But if you use your family as a way of loving and appreciating all the things that humans can be in their good and bad states, and if you take your engagement with your family and you use that as a framework for your engagement with everyone, then that becomes a more positive value. So it's a little bit like a hierarchy. I like to think of it more as a spectrum to remove the hierarchy bit. But yeah, there are some values that are more praised than others. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. I like this reframing that's happened, or that you're like illuminating. Another question we have is, how was Guru Nanak able to connect with people so effectively, even very different points of view? What lessons can be drawn and applied to current day issues? Is it much easier to stay within your own bubble instead of proactive interaction? This comes from Britbal Singh in Dallas.
This is a great question. I think one thing that helped Guru Nanak Sahib a lot was being able to speak in the context and the language of the people he was seeking to influence, and have, offer something to. So this means that Guru Nanak Sahib knew a variety of languages. If he was speaking to a Muslim audience, he would make references to Islam. If he's speaking to an audience of a Hindu background, he'd make references to the Vedas, etc. So I think there's a lot of fear these days that like if you learn about something or you engage with something, you're gonna be like influenced by it, and it reflects with sort of like fear about purity and impurity, which again, purity and impurity are all illusions, as we see throughout Gurbani, and we will discuss in this course later on. So we shouldn't fear. Any form of fear comes out of ego. So we really need to stop being scared that by engaging and by looking at something that we're going to be affected. You can still have a very firm stance, but you are looking at the context other people are coming from. So you're not running away from it. You're not scared of it. And I think this particularly applies to interfaith engagement. I think there's this worry that either you'll get corrupted by something, or that interfaith engagement. I have had this worry about interfaith engagement just kind of watering down everyone's backgrounds into one thing that everyone can approach. But Guru Nanak Sahib was really good at really like affirming and highlighting things while still being really firm and having his own path, his own lexicon, and saying, hey, we're here and we're doing it this way, and me being willing to engage and oftentimes even being an expert in other people's ways isn't gonna water anything down or make someone, it's like a tree. It's strong. It's not gonna wilt over. So yeah, and I think we have another question about the portraits of the gurus. I can go ahead and answer that.
Yeah, go ahead. I can just read it aloud for everyone. It was, if there are no portraits of the gurus, when did their pictures start appearing? And this is from Surinder in Hawaii.
Great. So yeah, so that's the question I was looking at. Was about the portraits of the gurus. They started appearing early on. I mean, there is a whole painting tradition of Janamsakhi miniatures. However, the standard Guru Nanak Sahib painting that like all of us grew up with, this one with the hand, I think that one's quite modern. I actually do not know the answer to that, but I really would say in the past half century, that's when that came about. And then it became kind of mass produced and standardized because, it's like easy to print a million things. I mean, if you look at older miniature paintings in Janamsakhi miniatures, for example, there's a lot of diversity in the way Guru Nanak Sahib is portrayed. And I think there's more value to having a diverse set of representations that we know none of them are accurate, but if we have a lot of diversity, then I think that's better than having one singular representation that we know is flawed. And I think it's nice to uplift and highlight artists' individual expressions of how they envision Guru Nanak Sahib in their head rather than sticking to that mass-produced portrait. But yeah, it started early on. But the style of painting then was similar to how the Janamsakhis kind of have this mythological character. It wasn't like, oh, you sit down and we take a painting of you. That was actually
Again, so sorry about that. This issue, we will get it figured out in the coming weeks. And also in regards to the painting question, I've been informed that Soba Singh painted the first Guru Nanak portrait for anyone who is interested. Yes. Thank you, Asha.
I appreciate that. I didn't know who did the first portrait, so
no worries. I didn't either. I was actually just externally informed. So yeah, we're all learning together. Thank you so much again, Asha, for leading us through this third week. Again, I think, this chiseling away I'm always thinking about in our learning and on our understanding of Sikhi. Thank you, everyone that attended, for your questions, and apologies for those whose questions were not addressed due to time constraints. Please note again that a recording of this live class will be available within 24 hours. Please tune in next week for the 4th session of this live course. We are also hosting live bi-weekly webinars. Our next one is on Children's Day on June 14th. Please join us as we welcome various presenters, some who will be joined by their wonderful children, to engage with Shabad, Saki, storytelling, art, music, and more. These various activities will help children learn about Sikhi in new and creative ways, prompting lots of questions and space for self-discovery. And lastly, do not forget to tune into the Sikhcast, a podcast produced by Sikhi, where we explore the various issues and events affecting Sikhs worldwide. Thank you for joining in. Today's live class will be ending now. Vaheguru Ji Ka Khalsa, Vaheguru Ji Ki Fateh.